US's tactical use of its money as a weapon system in Afghanistan created a criminal state. And if you look at the bigger picture in relation to what you said, global economic dynamics, where now US is using its financial might, weaponizing its financial might to pressure countries to align with this global agenda in containing China and so forth. So you can see the vulnerabilities, and a lot of countries are exacerbating, and that presents a serious challenge for global South and global security.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Timor. Really fascinating how you kind of looked at it from kind of 3 points, right? The political, the development, and the security impairment. I'd like to turn to Francis now, linking especially to the, I guess, the development impediment, because of course, if we think about what we are trying to achieve in those countries, taking away those resources or the way in which those resources just leave the country the way Timor described has an impact on what happens locally. But of course, also we need to think about the conditions in those countries in the first place. So from your work also on horizontal inequalities and what we know about how that affects security locally, could you tell us a bit more about how we can connect that to the global level as well?
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the title Global Security, I immediately thought, what are the threats to individuals today? And actually, the sort of threats we're talking about really are not in a way so important as some of the other threats. I'm just mentioning this because I do think very seriously that if you think of the number of people who actually die, the threat to nutrition is vastly greater than any sort of violent conflict. The threat of climate change is overwhelmingly important. The threat of global pandemics, we know, and now we are really becoming aware of the threat of artificial intelligence. So much so that people seriously think human extinction is, quite probable in this century or the next. So I just put that aside. We're not talking about that, but I don't really feel we can talk about global security without thinking of these really major threats. Now, coming to the threats to conflict, particularly in developing countries, a whole series of theories have been put forward about them. One is a sort of individualistic theory, which speaks a lot to some of the things that Timor was talking about, that people are greedy, leaders are greedy. You can see in the Sudan, in a way, this fight between these two military leaders can well be interpreted as a fight for power, but also a fight for resources. And that's often the case. So an individualistic interpretation is quite popular, but normally you need some form of organization to have a systematic conflict. Individuals have to get together. You can't, just as one person, unless you happen to be the military leader, you can't really conduct a conflict. And that's where groups are so important. And my work has been focused on group inequalities. How, if you find major inequalities between groups within a country and also between a country and in regions, you can get conflict. And we need to think about what kind of inequalities we're talking about. There are many dimensions, and you said at the beginning, can one focus on one dimension? And I think the answer is one can't. I mean, economic inequalities are very important at all sorts of levels, land inequality, asset, employment, and so on, and motivate people. They have a grievance and it motivates people to get together and fight. But political inequalities are also vitally important, and inequality in representation in government, or even exclusion of major groups in government. And when these things go together, so people are deprived economically and also excluded politically, then what can they do? The only thing they can resort to is violence. And so you find that the leaders particularly have a big political motive to conduct violence at that point. And the people who are doing the fighting have an economic and also a social motive if they are lacking access to education, to health, and so on. And then finally, there's the cultural dimension, that if their own culture is not respected, if you're not allowed to practice your religion, if your language is not respected, and we can see all this happening in many of the conflicts around the world, that's the sort of thing that really matters. I mean, we see some of the conflict in Northern Ireland, for example, about whether which flag is flying over the city of Belfast. I mean, it sounds quite trivial, but it's very motivating. So horizontal inequalities are a combination of all these different things. And we find many, many examples. I could list hundreds, but Burundi, Rwanda, Mindanao, Nepal, and so on and so forth. And almost most conflicts, when you really get down to it, have these group inequalities. But I wouldn't say that they're the exclusive cause. I think the private motivation is there too, that people are looking for riches. You find more conflicts in oil-rich countries. You find more conflicts in the sort of societies where people can grab money, the sort of things that Timor was talking about. So there's a combination. And there's a lot of evidence which supports certainly the horizontal inequality case. I mean, there are case studies, but you need to look to econometric studies, which also show that same thing, that certainly countries with higher group inequalities, higher horizontal inequalities, tend to have more conflict. And what's quite interesting is you can see it also at the global level, and a lot of the, particularly Muslims versus Christians, you find that in most societies, the Muslims are deprived relative to the Christians or other religions. And that again is an underlying motive for global conflict as well as for local conflict. So I guess that's what I'm going to say for the moment.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Yeah, really interesting to see how we can think about groups both at the local level, but also at the global level. And it's exactly this interaction, of course, that then also matters. You also mentioned at the beginning, you framed it by saying, well, actually, we need to think about other threats as well, right? The climate change, pandemics, nutrition, AI. Well, nuclear proliferation is perhaps another issue here that, of course, is also on the forefront of people's minds. So I'm really, really glad that we have Nickolas here with us as well, to help us kind of link it to that dimension, and also link it to what we've done in the previous webinar on the political dimension. So Nickolas, let me get to you and ask you how you think economic factors in that sense matter for global security if you draw on your research also on the political economy of nuclear proliferation, because of course it is not only about politics, right? We need to factor in economics as well. So please share with us your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for having me talk about on this panel to talk about nuclear risks from what I think is a very important perspective. And when we think about potential nuclear catastrophe throughout the Cold War, it was at the top of people's minds, the potential that there could be a nuclear exchange, in particular between the United States and Russia. But after the Cold War, that concern subsided to some extent, but the arsenals to a large extent didn't subside. And what we're seeing now with the increased tension between the United States and Russia, between Russia and NATO, that the enormous danger posed by nuclear weapons has continued even after the Cold War. And while we often think of a large exchange between nuclear weapons states, it's worth pointing out that even what some might consider a relatively small number of nuclear weapons, at least much smaller than what the United States and Russia currently have deployed, could have an enormous impact on human life, both in the short term and the long term. There's been some really interesting research in the last couple years, building upon existing research, looking at what even a small exchange between India and Pakistan, what the impact would be on human life. And the fatality estimates are in the more than 100 million, and having profound impacts on agricultural growth long term, and that's even a small nuclear exchange. But it's also worth pointing out that an area of risk that I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the potential that a non-state actor could potentially acquire nuclear weapons, which is still an ongoing threat, something that got a lot of attention a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago, but continues to be a significant risk. Even a single, what would be considered a very, very small nuclear weapon, say in the heart of a major city, could result in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and certainly have political and economic repercussions throughout the world. And in terms of how this intersects, how these risks and how efforts to reduce them intersect with economics, it's very hard to identify an element where this isn't, where these issues don't intersect with economics. Certainly, the decision to develop nuclear weapons is a major economic undertaking. Even in the United States, the amount of money we spend and we plan to spend on nuclear weapons over the next several decades is in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. In the United States, there are some who call the effort to modernize the air, land, and sea elements of our nuclear weapons. They call it the $1 trillion triad. So obviously that is a major undertaking, but also the decisions on whether to not just build your nuclear weapons, but to perpetuate and maintain those arsenals, decisions about whether or not to retain them. And when I think about some of, at least structurally in the United States, how those decisions are made, I think, for example, the state of New Mexico, which has I believe, about around a $95 billion GDP, at a rough estimate of how much of that money, because of nuclear weapons research and laboratories that exist in that state, it's probably about 8 to 10% of the GDP comes from nuclear weapons in just the state of New Mexico. And obviously, that can impact political decision-making at both the state and the national levels. There's also, and that was strictly when thinking about the decision to acquire or to maintain nuclear weapons. There's also the element of the acquisition of civilian nuclear technology, which is also a major financial undertaking. And in the United States, one of the ongoing discussions is to what extent should this be a private sector free market endeavor, and to what extent should the government be involved in investing and subsidizing nuclear power. And because of the capital costs in building large nuclear power plants are so significant, the extent to which government is willing to get involved can literally be the difference between a decision to move forward with nuclear power and a decision not to. And certainly the resources available to a government in being able to make those decisions can be an enormous factor. The two other elements that I want to touch upon are using economic factors as a tool to restrain the spread of nuclear technology. And certainly, I think one element of that that's gotten a lot of attention is the use of sanctions, which is a hotly debated topic on the effectiveness in terms of non-proliferation. But another element is to what extent competing states should make demands on potential clients as to what requirements should be imposed upon them about technologies. So, for example, the United States and the UAE have an agreement that the UAE will not pursue certain types of technology, enrichment and reprocessing. Those are sort of the two key technologies to produce nuclear weapons usable material. The UAE will not develop indigenous reprocessing and enrichment technologies. There's an ongoing debate as to what extent the country should ask for the same concessions from other states. And of course, one of the key pieces of that discussion is the extent to which countries would be willing to accept those constraints, or simply partner with another state that didn't provide those, create those constraints. and even offered less expensive options in terms of nuclear technology acquisition. And we're seeing this play out with Russia as well. Russia dominates the civilian nuclear the civilian nuclear industry around the world. And there's a question in light of what we've seen at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, with Rosatom having participated in the occupation of that facility. Will its dominance continue? Will countries continue to want to participate, buy reactors from Russia? Will other states step up and find ways of being more competitive with Russia? And we're seeing both signs that countries are still willing to partner with Russia, but we're also seeing signs that maybe the market is shifting to some extent. The last item that I would mention is simply budgets for nonproliferation and budgets in the United States for nonproliferation. There's a cost-benefit analysis that maybe tacitly takes place in the United States about how much we prioritize nuclear weapons production and maintenance versus how much we prioritize nonproliferation, preventing nuclear terrorism. And what we've seen in the United States is a significant increase, almost, well, 200 to 300% increase over the last decade in the amount of money spent on nuclear weapons production and maintenance, and a flat budget for nonproliferation. And what this tells me is that there's been an asymmetry in perceptions of approaches to risk reduction, at least in the United States. There are other elements, there are other ways economics certainly permeate nuclear risk reduction and nuclear nonproliferation, but those are certainly some of the major ones that are impacting policy at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nickolas. I noticed we've lost Timor, but let's hope he'll just quickly come back. Before I comment on this, Francis, would you like to react, or Nickolas, would you like to react on comments that were made previously? Or if not, I will. Francis?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating what Nickolas just been saying. And I just wondered whether his work offered any prospect of hope that people, to persuade a country like Northern Korea, which seems absolutely trigger happy on nuclear and determined to keep it because it's the only way it has any sort of status in the world, whether he's got anything to say about how one might improve that situation.
Nickolas.
Well, I appreciate you asking me the easy questions first. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation in North Korea, and you know, the policy for a number of countries is still to pursue denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That obviously seems increasingly difficult, and the policy options for achieving that seem few and far between. I think at this point, what we should be hoping for is to have a stable relationship with North Korea. And you know, I'm hopeful that North Korea, you know, the rhetoric has been the case in other countries, you know, does not hopefully match the intent of what it plans to do with its nuclear arsenal. And what one could hope for, and what there are certainly signs of, is sort of a traditional deterrent relationship with North Korea. In terms of how to pursue risk reduction, I mean, I look to the Cold War for those lessons, looking for more mechanisms for transparency, stability, looking for dialogue on crisis management. I would hope, and I realize that's difficult right now, I would hope to, at least in the short term, that could be what we would look towards, and in the longer term, look towards some longer risk reduction mechanisms.
Can I just come back on this a second, because I'm, you know, really interested, obviously. I've been wondering whether one couldn't reproduce at a regional level what was done relatively successfully between East and West, US and Russia. So, for example, Pakistan and India could come, have their red telephones and all the things that you need, and eventually come to talk about whether it couldn't have some mutual control over the stockpile. And similar thing might take place in the Middle East and so on. I was wondering if that was rather than try and do things at a global level, which is so difficult, we've discovered in every single area, it's so much easier to do things at a regional level.
I mean, that seems like a reasonable approach. And I think when we have seen areas of progress, it's been because regional actors played a significant role. So I would agree with you on that front.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Thanks. I'm glad we see that Timor is now back as well. Timor, we just talked more about North Korea also and how to reduce the nuclear risk, what the mechanisms could be here. I'd like to now also just bring in some of the questions from the audience members that I've received, and also tie this a little bit to my thoughts on how this all links together, because you all, in a way, I mean, now we were talking about states, but you also all mentioned the relevance of non-state actors here. Timor, you said that terrorists are using illicit financial flows. Nickolas, you talked about the risk of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of those other actors. Francis, you, of course, talked about groups that are led often by non-state actors. So I was wondering, in the current climate where we focus on Russia, on China, or right now on North Korea, are we underestimating their potential? And are we also perhaps ignoring the potential for collusion here? And that then links to one of the questions that I'm just going to read out that I've received, probably mainly to Francis and Stuart, which is, in settings where individualistic greed and desire for power are a motivating force, how do corrupt leaders and criminals cooperate, considering that they are often incentivized to distrust each other? So how can we think about that interaction also between state and non-state, especially when it comes to economic motivations? Timor, would you like to maybe respond first if you're fully back, and then Francis?
I think I'm fully back. I'm sorry for that. That's a great question. Where corrupt elites and collaborate. I think one area definitely where we see, and it goes back to your question earlier about where licit and illicit interact and where it becomes licit and illicit. I certainly think that that tax havens and offshore centers as global assemblages, where it brings lawyers, firms, bankers, and so forth, create that space for which there is massive collaboration taking place, where illicit money is laundered and becomes licit through investment in developed countries, and particularly in developed countries. And that's where you see a lot of collaboration between corrupt officials, criminals, armed groups, and so forth. So that was my understanding of the question. I joined very late. That's where I think this space creates that enables that collaboration. Having said that, I think it is important to highlight that developed countries, in particular West, needs to look in the mirror and take some of the blame, because most of this money ends up in developed countries, and it creates massive amount of industry and jobs and so forth, and it increases poverty in developing countries. So therefore, there is a key question in terms of how do you address this challenge, where developed countries need to look in the mirror and say, well, what sort of intervention, both policy, standards, mechanism needed in order to ensure we see disruption in this illicit financial flow industry. And maybe finally, in relation to what is happening now in light of Ukraine, rivalry between the great powers, This is, I wonder, I don't have an answer for that. I wonder if this is going to disrupt the illicit financial flows. So far, I haven't seen the evidence. I mean, Ukraine is a great, the invasion of Ukraine and how sanctions were imposed on the Russian oligarchs is fascinating. But I haven't really seen evidence to see that Western countries are taking steps to disrupt this industry and this market, which they benefit from. But certainly there will be a lot of inward from places like China. China is massive on the list of outflow of money. I mean, we'll definitely see more intervention from the Chinese and the Chinese government or the Communist Party on curbing down on the Chinese elites taking the money out. There seems to be, I don't really know that market, but there is an argument that most of the money goes back to China in terms of investment, but I haven't really seen that. So I think that will have an impact on that. But in terms of corrupt elites, as I gave the example of Afghanistan, just over a year now, these criminals are now massively investing in Caribbean, buying passports, and actually also disrupting the gold smuggling in places like Sierra Leone and others.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Francis, would you like to pick up on that and perhaps also, again, on how we can actually think, is there such a division as state and non-state?
Well, I think there is a division between state and non-state, though I can see that criminalized states are moving away from that. But many of these states are very weak and really absent in a lot of places. I mean, you take West Africa, where the northern regions are really subject to systematic conflict, and we read about them the whole time, kidnapping and murders and so on and so forth. We need to think, are there any non-state actors that can take a role? I mean, people want security. People understand. It's not like they don't understand any of this, the people on the ground. And there are particular organizations which can be very helpful. And it's notable that some of the religious organizations are much more effective in terms of delivering services and protecting people than the state in some areas. And even if you go to some universities, and I won't name the particular countries, and you see everything in disarray, and then you see that there is the mosque and there is the church and things are well organized and so on. So I think we shouldn't discount that. And sometimes the groups get together to such an extent that they actually recreate an authority, which you might say about Somaliland. So it's not out of the question. There are also women's groups that can be very effective and get together. There are even militia groups, which we've done some research on, whose main function and the reason people join is that they create security for their members, and they underwrite their basic needs as well as creating helping them avoid violence and so on. So I think there's a lot of human activity. We shouldn't think nothing's happening out there, which is a reaction to the absence of an effective state.
Thanks so much. Nickolas, maybe the type of non-state actors that we now just heard, the church, women's groups, are probably quite different from the terrorists that you were describing previously. And perhaps also if you think about how that links with states, could you also comment on that, especially thinking about those supply chains that are, of course, I mean, when we think about nuclear proliferation, that are crucial, but also that draw on, in a way, on resources that come both from the licit and the illicit realm.
So, like Professor Stewart, my first the first thought that I had in thinking about the role of the state in non-proliferation or proliferation to non-state actors was the absence of the state or the weakness of the state. And when you think about the key building blocks for the acquisition of nuclear weapons and the key building blocks for a non-state actor, it's highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And the easiest way for a non-state actor to acquire those materials is by accessing a facility that isn't adequately protected or in transit. And the most effective way of doing that is is to find a state that doesn't have full control over its facilities, that has weak security, that isn't making the proper investments, or even further down on the other end of the spectrum, a state that's where there's civil conflict or where there's intrastate conflict. So it's the absence of the state or the absence of control over these key materials that, to me, is one of the key intersections with acquisition of nuclear weapons to non-state actors. I think the other element of that is, once you acquire the materials, where can you design such a weapon? Where can you plan something out? And at least in the case of Al-Qaeda, during their sort of well-documented pursuit of nuclear weapons, they were using ungoverned areas in Afghanistan to both plan and design a nuclear weapon.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Now, we've talked about state actors, non-state actors. Perhaps here the elephant in the room is also private sector, right? When you talk about the economic dimension and how companies have a role to play, but also private institutions such as banks. And this brings me to another question that I was now received from the audience. And by the way, there is a Q&A function, so people can also send questions there. So here's a question for Timor, which is, what is the role of private institutions such as banks to facilitate or prevent illicit money flows? But I would expand that and address the entire panel in terms of what is the role of the private sector in also reducing risks to global security. Timor, if you want to go first.
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, banks are the sort of intermediary player in all of these illicit financial flows infrastructure. So they play an important role in terms of facilitating the flow of money, but also they can play an important role in curbing the flow of money, in introducing more monitoring, putting more monitoring mechanisms in place, sharing and collecting data on the beneficiaries, which they don't do right now. What is interesting is there was this study conducted by Findlay on the global shell. There's a book called Global Shell Games, and they found Western banks were a lot open to accepting corrupt money from developing countries than actually developing countries. And that says a lot. So banks can play an important role in all of that. And I think that's my key argument is, how do we disrupt the role of the intermediary? Banks being one of those key players in terms of governments, or internationally, given that this is a global problem, we introduce international mechanism that would force banks to register assets and identify the beneficiaries of the offshore bank companies and so forth, which hasn't happened. So that's one. Now, in terms of the private sector, now, in terms of where I have my research relates to, and again goes back to the argument of groups, which made me think about, is in my book I talked about network forms of organizations being violent, and as Professor Stewart noted clearly, it's the organizations that go to war. Sino's argument, not the individuals, and as such, I looked at the role of networks and network forms of organizations. But what happens when criminal networks are aligned with corrupt officials, with organization, with, let's say in this case, in the case of Afghanistan, a jihadi tanzim, which is political military organization, emerged in the 1980s and 90s, and captured significant part of the Afghan state, its economy, army, and police. And then collapse happened. And suddenly, what happened to that entity, both the criminal private sector and also the organization itself? Well, it seems that they have now gone to invest in Africa, in Caribbean countries, and so forth. They have both passports. So that raises a very interesting question. What happens to groups and organizations when the state collapses and they lose the platform upon which they operate? And the same thing goes with criminal enterprises in the private sector. What happens to them once the platform is no longer there as the state? And it seems that offshore havens provide an excellent platform where they could transition to.
Thanks so much. Thanks. You pointed to the role of intermediaries. Banks are intermediaries, but of course, they're also powerful brokers that connect different steps of the supply chain that might facilitate also the contacts between different actors in there. I think that's another important, crucial factor to keep in mind. Let me go to Nickolas now, and then Francis afterwards. Would you like to react as well?
Sure. And staying on the connecting it to the topic that we were last discussing of acquisition to non-state actors. In a lot of countries, you see that some of the facilities that possess these materials, or even that are major nuclear facilities, and where sabotage could play have a significant economic and humanitarian impact. These are facilities that are run by private sector companies. And what you see a number of issues with these companies. One, and the most important thing, is that this means that at the end of the day, the people who are implementing the most important maybe aspect of nuclear risk reduction or prevention are private sector companies. The guards on the ground, the organizing, the corporate structures. These, at the end of the day, for all of the government policy, for all of the international structures, it's going to, in a lot of cases, it could be private sector companies that are actually executing the actual security measures, which means they are playing a tremendously important role in nuclear risk reduction, and they need to be part of that process. They need to buy into whatever policies are being adopted by states. But beyond that, what you also see, and this is understandable, is a tension between, at least in the private sector, between profit and what might be perceived as cost or overhead. And that is something that is always at the top of our minds when we're thinking about what types of measures should facilities adopt. They need to make sense economically for a private sector company in order for them to be adopted. So that is another major factor. And then the last, and this is something that I was part of a workshop that we're discussing just a few days ago, which is how to ensure that the private sector at a national level and in countries around the world are talking not just to international organizations and they're part of multilateral discussions, but that they're talking to other private sector companies as well and learning lessons from incidents and improving their practices as a result. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nickolas. Francis, over to you.
Yes, well, I think it follows on nicely from what Nickolas said. But companies are part of the problem unless governments control them. They don't have a motive. They're not going to suddenly become sort of angels and come out of, start going in the right direction. It depends what is profitable for them. And if you have government control and if government directs them, they can play a huge role. For example, part of the peace process in Northern Ireland was to get fair employment in the private sector. And it happened, but it happened because they put into effect, the governments put into effect legal requirements that it should happen and then monitored it. Similarly, sort of situation happened in Malaysia where the whole set of legislative requirements, which meant that the private sector played a big role in righting inequalities. But left to itself, it won't. You take the Delta region of Nigeria, where the presence of oil, there's continuous minor conflict about that. And basically, it's because it's a totally underdeveloped area. And the only way that poor people can get anything is by trying to steal the oil and by disrupting everything. And if the private sector, if the oil companies, which are often international, put a lot into the development of that region, the whole thing might turn around, but it won't turn around unless they do that voluntarily, and they don't. So, yeah, I think the private sector could play a huge role, but it has to be controlled by governments. And then we're back to the earlier question that we have weak governments and not well-motivated governments. And so it's not going to happen, or maybe not happen very often.
Thank you so much. Right, Nickolas, is this a two-finger?
Yeah, it's a two-finger. I think Professor Stewart raised a really important point that relates to non-proliferation is, in my world, the role of the regulator, and ensuring that there's a strong regulator that requires a high level of safety and security at nuclear facilities. Because I agree, if left to their own devices, it is there are many competing interests in the private sector that might distract from major priorities like safety and security.
Thanks so much. So that gets us back to, also the point about the state, what happens not just when there's the absence of the state, but also when there's a dysfunctional state, right? Or when the regulation is not implemented properly. We are coming to the end of the webinar. We only have one hour. I know we could continue quite long, but I'd just like to add one point here, which is also useful for the audience. If there's any book or publication or podcast that you would recommend coming from that angle, feel free to tell us now, or if not, we collect this afterwards as well. And we'll also make sure to pick up the points that you are all contributing in the following webinars and get back to you on that as well. So if any of you has any book recommendation or podcast, I know Francis will send us something later on, but Timor or Nickolas, is there anything you'd like to mention now or at a later point?
Thank you. I recently discovered this book by Findlay, Nilsson, and Sharan, Global Shell Games. I think that's a very good book. And to be biased, my PhD supervisor who wrote this book called Dictators Without Border. So Alexander Cooley and John Hadershaw. I do recommend both of these books, very relevant.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Nickolas, any recommendation from you?
It's an advertisement, not a recommendation and an advertisement. But on July 18th, the Nuclear Threat Initiative is going to be releasing its next iteration of its Nuclear Security Index, and this is the only comprehensive evaluation of nuclear security conditions in countries around the world. This is going to be, our last index was released in 2020. This will be looking at the vast majority of the COVID era and how countries have fared in terms of nuclear security risk reduction over that period. So we'll be having an event. It's going to be an in-person event, but we'll also there'll be a webinar component on July 18th.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Could you keep us informed about the webinar, how we get in on it?
I would be happy to. We don't have a link available right now, but I'm happy to share it when the email goes out.
Please also send it to us, and we'll make sure to advertise it as well. Right. But thank you so much. Thanks so much for these fascinating insights and a lot of food for thought. No answers necessarily, but more questions, which is a good thing. So thank you so much. And please join us also next week when we'll be talking about the social dimension of global security, picking up on some of the points that were made today as well. Thank you so much. Thanks. Goodbye.